I'm Joe Flood with Joe Flood Insurance, protecting what matters.
And I'm Chad Latour from Flood Risk Solutions, where innovation meets flood coverage.
And this is the Flood Brothers Podcast.
We'll guide you through flood insurance trends
and keep you dialed in on market changes. Well, Chad, we're back with another episode of Flood Brothers. How is everything going down in Florida?
So far, it's been very quiet, which we're super happy to report. So it's been, no real activity to speak of. There's a disturbance out there now that I'm sure you've seen in the Atlantic, way off anywhere near land, hoping that it goes north like the last couple of disturbances. So, but as you know, we're just now entering peak hurricane season. So praying and hoping it stays quiet. The last thing Florida needs, or anybody for that matter, is a hurricane. So
a lot of people are saying how the season's over already. And
right.
It's just, and we are just getting to peak season. And to your, to what we were talking about before we jumped on here, is that this is the time of year when stuff starts to creep in from the Gulf, right? The season is shifting from kind of the African waves down into the Caribbean and Gulf waves.
That's exactly right. And we saw last year, and I hate to even mention Helene and Milton, they developed right in the Gulf, right? Just out of the blue. It was, the craziest thing I've ever seen, where they kind of predicted that within a matter of days something was going to develop down in the Gulf. So again, there's nothing out there at this point, so hopefully we keep it that way.
Yeah, I remember last year what sticks out to me, Chad, is how late the season was in really kicking off. I mean, I think Milton wasn't even until October.
It wasn't. In fact, you're right. Helene was at the end of September. So I think it was like the 26th, 27th, something like that. And
Yeah,
then, you're right, Milton came along like 2 weeks after. So
yeah. So far so good, but
yeah,
like you said, the season's going to fire off here and really get started over the next couple weeks. An early quiet season, as we know, doesn't mean anything for
absolutely.
later in the year.
And what's interesting too is I don't know if you've looked at the tropical update, but there's actually two storms out in the Pacific, which is kind of odd, right? You don't see many storms
Yeah.
out there. So that would be will be interesting to see where those end up. They usually stay off the coast, I believe. Not many actually approach land, so we'll see.
Yeah, I think one's going to kind of careen into Mexico and create some disturbance in the southeast in an area that may actually even be able to use some of that rain, and then I think the rest is tailing off just south of Hawaii. I saw, but you and I both write business in Hawaii, and
Hmm.
it's an area that even though there's not a lot of surge exposure there, rainfall is always a concern, and
Right.
Hawaii has some unique topography where that could be a major issue.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I found interesting is, and we hear this term all the time. I think I mentioned it to you before we jumped on here. Is Milwaukee had some flash flooding, and they're calling it a 1,000-year event, which we know. You hear that and people think, okay, well, we had our 1,000-year event, we're good for the next 1,000 years, and it just doesn't work that way. It's any time it can rain, there's a chance of flooding, right? And that's every year. So
Yeah,
I don't really like those terms, the 100-year floodplain. I think it's a misconception to most folks that aren't in the business, that they think that you have these events and again, they're not going to happen again, or they're unlikely to happen. But that's not the case. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
yeah, from an underwriting standpoint, Chad, riverine and rain exposure scare me the most. Hurricane and coastal exposures are pretty, I mean, I say easy, but like we can measure the distance a surge, an amount of surge can get into a location. It's very difficult to quantify what a random rain event is going to do. If
Right.
you get these, we had an area up here just north of where I live in Massachusetts that got on a random July morning 6 inches of rain in a couple hours. It shut a highway down. It flooded some buildings, and it was a only a 5 square mile area that got that rain.
Wow.
So like how do you measure that? I mean, we've got pluvial and alluvial, estimates and drainage basin numbers that we can pull from data sources, but at the end of the day, when you've got these pop-up rainstorms, those are the ones that scare me the most from an underwriting perspective. In fact, I'll tell you our largest loss on a risk came from a rainfall event. We've actually never had a coastal flooding loss, if you can believe that. It's been the few that we've had have all been rain events.
Right. I can believe it. And we've seen the same thing down here in Florida. It reminds me of a couple of years ago in Fort Lauderdale. There was a storm that dropped like 28 inches of rain, I believe it was, pretty much over the Fort Lauderdale airport. You probably recall
Yeah,
they shut down the airport, and it was just like you said, just an afternoon storm that just dumped a ton of rain. It wasn't tied to a tropical storm or hurricane. It was just rain, you know.
yeah.
And I think we're seeing more and more of that because of the heat. I'm sure you're seeing it like down here. It's been incredibly hot, and when these storms pop up, they just dump a ton of rain.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those situations, Chad, when we're looking at, like concentration of risk. That's the reason why, from an underwriting perspective, trying to place some of this business, as you know, when you've got 20, 30, 40 buildings and you're trying to get a limit across all of them, that's when it starts to become difficult because you're not going to have a loss at one or two if you've got one of these storms parked overhead. You're
Right.
going to have a loss at each one of those buildings. So it just becomes, those are the situations we really get concerned about.
Absolutely.
What are, you're obviously in Massachusetts, we haven't had a hurricane make direct landfall since 1991's Hurricane Bob. Now we get nor'easters, so does the Mid Atlantic area, and each region of the country deals with. We saw a tsunami even earlier this year on the West Coast.
Right.
Um, when you're being in the Tampa region, what tools and information do you look to, or what do you advise people look to during storm season to kind of keep their eye on the risk that they may face?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually a couple of sites out there that I go to. One of them is Storm Surge Modeling. All right, Joe. So this is a site that I've used in the past. Actually, used it last year during Helene, and this allows you to kind of see in real time as the storm is approaching how that storm surge is coming in. So it obviously it's not a great example now because we're not in an active storm, but I believe you can actually model it from past events and kind of see how it impacted. So I'm going to try that real quick just to see here. Um, yeah, and it shows you now. I think that storm that's out there that has a chance of developing. But you can play around with this. Again, it really hits home because you can see, you know, how high the water is going to rise as the storm is approaching. So I again really like this site. This is the link up here you can see. So if you want to take a look at it and mess around with it, I'm not going to try to go in here and make any changes because again I haven't used this since last year. Hopefully I don't need to use it again this year. But it is a really good tool. I don't know if you have something that you've used, Joe, that's helped you in the past. I know you have a
Yeah.
you're writing in Florida that I'm sure you model out.
We do. We actually have some proprietary tools that we use, and I think this is a great tool, Chad. And I would encourage those watching and listening to go give the site name. It's the Sarah. It's Sarah, right?
Yeah, CERA dot coastalrisk dot live.
There you go. And
And
I've
again,
used that in the past before. And what's great about that tool, and really glad that you mentioned that, because that tool is going to allow people to see the surge potential in real time. And I think that's so misleading when you see some of these newscasts showing that surge line, like, oh, it's going to be this here and this here and that here, because as the storm shifts north and south, that line is constantly moving, and every inlet and every piece of elevation. And we wrote a primary home in Sarasota, ground zero for Milton, expected storm surge of I think 5 to 10 feet or whatever it was at the time,
Hmm.
and it received zero damage because just the trajectory of that storm, the surge didn't get there because, and if you had looked at the data like you just showed, you would have seen that. So, some of the tools that we have that we use to underwrite are proprietary, and I think in what I'll do in one of these. Um, Flood Brothers podcast in the future is I'll spend some time because our data is much more granular, not really good for what the home like what you showed is great for the average homeowner
Right.
trying to go in there and our tools are really meant for underwriting, so you're going to see a lot of data that makes no sense at all, but you are going to be able to see the surge, every single category of storm surge at any location that we choose, which I think is really interesting because it's supposed to be helping us predict what could happen there, whereas your site is really showing what is happening there, which I think is a
Right.
very powerful tool.
Absolutely.
Um, and it's interesting, Chad, because you and I were talking, before we jumped on, about just the sheer amount of coastal development going on in Florida, and I can vouch for that happening. There was just a big story about there's a like a 100 or so million-dollar development going in coastal Massachusetts, and there's this rising risk from various sources on our coast,
Hmm.
and yet we cease to stop building. So talk to us a little bit about what you see. I can tell you firsthand from the underwriting perspective what we're seeing, but why don't you start with some of what you're seeing in Florida?
Yeah. So just we were showing. I showed you this earlier. So just to start with that, this is downtown St. Pete. So, and I'm born and raised in St. Pete, and it's incredible to see the transformation of downtown. And this is actually our building here. And this used to be the tallest building in downtown St. Pete. So you can see these massive high rises, all residential. It's becoming a lot like Fort Lauderdale, much smaller scale at this point, but if they continue building like this, it's going to look identical. But many of these buildings, are on the water. This is the Tampa Bay behind these buildings. And this is just one little area, right? And this is happening all over Florida. To your point, Joe, we have a risk that I just had a submission on, and it's down in Miami. It's a massive apartment building, multi-million in the hundreds of millions project, and you got to wonder, like, how do we continue to build like this along the coast? I'm hoping that obviously it's we're going to resist some flooding. It's going to be built up high enough, but they still have to have flood insurance, and some of these are such a massive TIV. It makes it quite a bit of a challenge to get capacity in the market for some of these. But thankfully, we're able to do it. But yeah, it's just the amount of growth here is it's mind-boggling to see how it just continues to grow.
And that's a great point, Chad. And I mean, this is not unlike what I see, either from you or others all the
Hmm.
time in terms of, oh, we've just built this massive building, uh, and now we got to quantify what the flood insurance is going to cost on it, because of
Right.
course the lender is going to require it, and you built it in an AE zone, and now you're going to require flood insurance. And yes, there is, and I would say, I think we said it on our last episode, the market is kind of flush with capacity right now, and we're certainly seeing a lot of property carriers starting to sublimit the
Hmm.
flood in there, and there's certainly been this growth in capacity because the reinsurers and all the associated discussions around that. But it's just such an interesting dynamic because you're seeing this new coastal development. We're constantly being told, and data shows that the risk for flooding is increasing in our communities. We talked earlier about the rainfall flooding that we're seeing. Um, and yet we continue to develop these structures directly on the coast. So, thankfully, right now there's capacity to be able to insure these. I've got risks though. I just got done with one on the west coast of Florida where they're just not able to get that first layer to include business interruption. What are they going to do? They can't
Right.
close without it. So, like, what? I mean, it's not by any. I actually got two on the west coast. One is much larger than the other, but again, you see it all the time. I mean,
Oh yeah,
when people are thrown this issue out of nowhere, when you and I both know that it's not out of nowhere, it's because you clearly built these buildings in risky areas. I mean,
right.
what do we, I know what I tell people. I say, well, you should have gotten involved with us at the outset because we would have told you how to do things differently in the very beginning phase of construction. But
Right.
what do you saying to people when the cost, even when they can get the coverage, the cost is hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And there's really only one of two ways that I know of that goes down when you can't get the coverage that they're requiring for BI. One is the lender ends up forgiving the requirement, because there is no markets, or they accept parametric. Parametric can still come in with an option in many of those cases.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's good to have in the marketplace for sure. I know
hmm
you and I both done some deals that's exactly what's happened, or
right.
what we're seeing too. Chad, at the end of the day, is some people have to back out of those deals, because the coverage just isn't, and I think what's interesting too is and we're seeing a lot of lenders waive some of the larger requirements.
hmm
Again, we're being told that there's such a strain on the stability of the market if the risk is vulnerable, but yet we're seeing a lot of requirements be narrowed or eliminated or reduced. It's just a very interesting market because of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know, I really don't know, over the next couple of years, it's going to be this push and pull of the reinsurers are, they have the money and the cash and they want to
hmm
offer capacity, but yet we're going to see an increase in flood risk and storms. I mean, we've already seen this year, you mentioned one, the random rainfall events, the flash flooding,
hmm
and that's only going to continue in places that people don't expect. Have you seen an increase in Wisconsin quote requests?
No, I haven't, but we don't have much of a presence in that area,
Yeah.
so
We have we've seen an increase.
that
It's
is,
it's just funny because of course that's what happens. The
yeah,
flooding happens and then people go, "Oh, I probably should carry
100%.
flood."
You can see
It's
it like after every event. There's a huge amount of flood being purchased, and then if we go the following year without an event, then you start to see those policies non-renew. And it's just crazy to me that people start thinking it's just they have short-term memory, and they don't see the need if there's not anything going on, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah. Well, Chad, 20 minutes goes by quick, and we're
Wow.
just about at the end of our time. I know it's amazing, and I think keeping these short and to the point really helps, get our information across
hmm
quickly and effectively. And I think, you and I mentioned that we would end these podcasts by talking about risks that we're looking at something unique and different. I kind of was, the West Coast Florida one sticks out to me because it's seven buildings and they need BI to close, and we're just not able to get something on the primary layer. It's a tough risk. West Coast of
hmm
Florida modeled poorly.
Right.
Um, and can I find a solution? Right now, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
personally, I wouldn't write the risk if I was a carrier, but obviously, premium speaks,
Right.
and it's just West Coast of Florida is tough. I don't know if you've seen anything. I think the building you were showing earlier, or the one that you and I talked about in Miami, is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a massive one, just a huge TIV that's going to make it a challenge. I know that we can get it done. It's going to be quite expensive if they end up pursuing it. So, but I'm actually seeing on the East Coast, I've had a couple of submissions where agents are getting creative and trying to come up with ways to get private market to take some of the buildings. So almost like a hybrid model. So a couple of low-rise condo associations that I've had submitted recently where they're wanting to see if we could take, call it 10 buildings out of the 17 or so, and put them into the private market, leave the more hazardous ones with the NFIP, which we can certainly do. There's different ways to approach these, and that may save the insured some money going that route.
Mm, that's interesting. That's something that we've seen in the past, especially like you said, in tough locations. Condo associations, that might be a great solution for, especially when you can insure each building individually.
Right.
I think that's a great solution. So I would say, so kind of to summarize, I would say if you're on the west coast of Florida looking for flood insurance, it's going to be much more difficult than the east
Mhm.
coast. And if our listeners and viewers are wondering why, it's really comes down to a simple science of surge. On the west coast, you're going to get a higher surge because the what we call bathymetry or measurement at the bottom of the ocean is deeper. I mean, I'm sorry, more shallow, which
Mhm.
allows the waves to crest and come onto the shore much more aggressively than the East Coast, where things are deeper and the surge isn't as bad. And I don't know if you knew this, Chad, there was an update to Slosh recently
Mhm.
that actually exaggerates the West Coast surge and decreases the East Coast surge. So the issue
I
that I
believe it.
just mentioned, yeah, the issue I just mentioned is only going to get exaggerated more as the new slosh models come out.
Right. Yeah, and if you think about it, like I'm in Florida, obviously, but if you ever visit Florida and you go to the East Coast versus the West Coast, think about how quickly you can hit deep water when you're on the East Coast when you walk out on the beach versus the
Yep,
Gulf. You can sometimes walk out, then you're hitting like a sand. What do they call it? Hang on, my mind
the,
escapes me.
the sandbars.
Sandbar. So you hit a sandbar, like you know what I mean? Like it's just very shallow compared to the East Coast, which is why the
Yeah,
water comes inland much faster than it does on the East Coast.
yeah. Yeah, and that dynamic plays out all across the world.
Hmm.
As you have, like in Hawaii, there's really no surge risk. Yes, there is because water comes onto the land from the ocean, but in terms of getting that dramatic surge like you see in Florida on East or West Coast, the water is so deep there that the surge risk is almost zero.
Hmm.
So it's just an interesting um, dynamic as you look at, especially Florida, where of course most of the flood business in the country is placed. That dynamic will play out and continue to play out, but hopefully not play out this year. We're going to cross our
Yes.
fingers, continue to have a calm season. But our next podcast, sometime at the end of September, early October, hopefully we'll be in the same boat.
Absolutely. I would love to come on and talk about anything but storms that have occurred
Yeah,
this year.
hopefully we'll leave that in the distant past. No,
Yeah,
that's
we'll
great.
talk about all the storms that have passed off the coast.
Exactly, which this next one looks to be doing. So that's
Yeah.
great. That's great.
Awesome, Joe.
All right, Chad. Well, this is great. And until next time.
Yep, good seeing you. Take care.